Hello, welcome to HotSeat. I'm Martin Rogers, here with Professor Tony Travers to discuss the local election results across England and the UK, then move on to London and finally on to the EU referendum. Welcome, Tony. So first of all, this is our second HotSeat mentioning the local election results. So what more have we learned now that all of the results have come in?
Well, what we've learned is that the vote share for the major parties, Labour and the Conservatives, was in the low 30%. We'll get the final figures in a couple of weeks. And that, I think, tells us that these results were not great for Labour. Labour's been in opposition now for 6 years. They really ought to be doing very well in locals in order to convince, or to be convincing as the likelihood they'd win the 2020 general election. From the Conservatives' point of view, they slightly underperformed the expectations, I think, that had been set, but in the end they didn't do that badly. Their vote share is not that bad for a party of government. So if you look across the country, it's sort of not so good for Labour, and certainly if you look at the Wales and Scotland election results as well, you have to say from Labour's point of view they need to do much better than this in the elections next year and right the way through to 2020.
So we'll come on to discuss London in a moment, but to look across the rest of the UK, first of all, what is behind Labour's disappointing performance? The first opposition to lose local government seats and suffer a net loss of seats since the mid-1980s non-general election year. It's quite a poor result, really, for Labour. So what's behind that?
Well, I'm not sure any of us knows exactly what's behind it, but it's almost certainly the fact that the Labour leadership has not yet, in its own terms, found a way of projecting a new, powerful message to the electorate, which the electorate buys into. And this, we're at a curious point in time when the Conservative Party is ripping itself to bits over the EU referendum, but nevertheless, Labour can't break through. And I think that tells the Labour leadership they've got to come up with a much clearer message and a more popular message in time for the 2017 local elections and right the way through to the 2020 general.
So to move away from the major parties, to move on to UKIP. So it was a disappointing set of results for UKIP. They haven't really made a breakthrough, but they gained the second largest number of seats after the Liberal Democrats. Came second in a number of places behind Labour. So has this been a good, bad or indifferent result for UKIP?
Well, UKIP made progress, but having said that, these elections were ones where it could hardly be better circumstances for them. The EU referendum debate is in the news every day. And I think UKIP should have hoped really, to make some real progress off the back of that enormous prominence for their key issue. As it is, they made some progress, then they've come second in a number of Northern and Midlands metropolitan seats, and they've won some there too. But it's not a kind of great breakthrough, and I think UKIP, after the EU referendum, will have to think about its future as a party. If it wants really to motor on and to make a breakthrough, it's got to do rather better than it did in the locals and in Scotland. They did quite well in Wales, but in Scotland not so well. So they really have to think, what kind of long-term strategy do they have for their party?
So to move on to London then, a very positive result for Labour, but are we seeing London emerge as Labour's new heartland? We'll go on to discuss the result itself in a moment, but is this now right to consider London as Labour's heartland?
Well, London sticks out from the rest of the United Kingdom, the rest of Britain, remarkably. Poor result for Labour in Scotland, not a great result in Wales, and now, of course, there's a stalemate in the Welsh Assembly about who's to be First Minister. English local election results not so good, and yet in London, as predicted by the polls, who got this right, by the way, good day for the polls, opinion polls, Sadiq Khan won quite easily, and actually Labour did well in the Assembly as well. Now, what I think this tells us is that the Labour Party in London is increasingly completely different, or its voter base very different So that must be from that in the rest of the country. And that begs another further question for Labour, which is how to appeal to this Labour vote in London whilst also transmitting messages to the rest of England and Wales and Scotland that work there too. It's a real conundrum for Labour.
So the result in the end for Sadiq Khan was quite a comfortable one, but as we identified in our work, demographically London is very well suited to Labour. It is in some ways a Labour city, with Labour holding over 1,000 councillors, the vast majority of members of Parliament. Is this a good result or in line with expectations? And perhaps it would have been a loss that would have been a devastating and surprise result.
If you look at the first preference votes for Sadiq Khan and Zach Goldsmith and compare them with the percentage votes for Labour and the Conservatives at the general election last year, they're to within 1 percentage point in each case. So it looks as if the Labour vote turned out for Zach Goldsmith, for Sadiq Khan, and the Conservative vote turned out for Zach Goldsmith. And so each party turned out its own vote. Labour is ahead, other things being equal, of the Conservatives in London now. They've done that by, it's not that the Conservatives have fallen back, but Labour has managed to take over, to eat into the vote of many of the minor parties. So I think Labour did well in London, and Sadiq Khan overcame all the possible prejudice that a minority candidate might have faced in an election like this, to deliver a Labour victory very much in line with Labour's vote share. So it was a great victory for him personally as well.
So we've done a piece for the election series discussing the policies. So now comes the time for implementation. So what are we likely to see as realistic chances of certain policies being implemented?
Well, in London, and it was clear in the London election, housing is now the number one issue. And this is, again, it differentiates London not from all of the rest of the UK, but certainly the southeast of England has a housing challenge which is much more present than in, say, the north or in Wales. And so the challenge that faces Sadiq Khan now is how to at least keep building housing as fast as Boris Johnson was at in this last year of his term in office, and actually to up those numbers, and then to deliver on a commitment radically to increase the amount of affordable, called genuinely affordable housing. Now, these are big commitments, and with uncertainty in the economy as the result of the EU referendum, and also uncertainty in the housing market more generally that has nothing to do with the EU referendum. They've just got to keep motoring, and from day one keep building and increase building and actually find ways of delivering more affordable housing. And to do that is, I think, their biggest challenge by far. Is,
in your view, are measures such as social rent or London living rent, these measures, rent controls, are they likely to make a significant difference at the sort of macro level, or is it just about the supply of housing?
Well, there's no question that supply is the main way of generating more moderate house prices and indeed rentals. That in the long term, but the challenge of delivering 50,000 homes a year is a very considerable one. This year, 27,000 perhaps, and that's up on previous years. It's big stuff. The Mayor, of course, doesn't have the power to introduce rent controls. I mean, it would require national government action, and I doubt very much a Conservative government's going to do that. So the question then is, how far can the Mayor use his powers, and indeed the powers through the London Plan, to regulate the market, to ensure that there is more really affordable housing? And as I say, this is going to be a huge challenge given the expectations. And the fact that every 2 weeks is 1% of the Mayor's term of office, and when we get to 2020, then the Mayor will be judged, Sadiq Khan will be judged by the housing commitment more than any other, because it's a very, very clear one.
Does Khan face, to some extent, a trade-off between maintaining London as a business capital of the world and delivering on his affordable housing pledge? Is that even something that's within his remit and his powers?
Well, I mean, in London, there is always a risk of sort of seeing, to quote the American sports star Yogi Berra, that this place is so full, no one wants to come here anymore. There's always that risk of seeing London as it's sort of so successful, nobody will want to live here, and that clearly isn't yet true. The population is still rising fast. But there are issues. It'd be stupid to deny that there are house prices make it difficult for people to buy for the first time, and rentals are going up, and something has to be done about that. But the mayor can't. It's not like New York where you have rent control. Can't impose rent control. So the real challenge is how to produce a long-term increase in supply, extra increase in supply, and an expectation that will continue, because that would moderate prices and rents.
So you talked about New York, and Berlin has also been mentioned as an international precedent for action on affordable housing. So what is really within the mayor's powers, other than the use of brownfield, mayor-owned, TfL-owned land that Khan and others identified as land that can be used for building additional units?
Well, I mean, there's lots of public sector land out there, Transport for London, amongst others. The challenge, I think, is that many of Sadiq Khan's supporters would hope that that land would be provided at below market prices to deliver housing at below market prices. Challenge, though, is that if you're TfL, you want the maximum value out of your land to help pay for the reductions in government grant that will undoubtedly be there in the future. And anyway, TfL needs the money to build Crossrail 2, and the NHS needs any money from its estate to help pay for health services. So there's a kind of risk that we'll see public sector land as a sort of something that can be used several times over to buy lots of different things. It can only be used once. So I think that we're going to have to see ingenuity. We'll see higher densities. The mayor will be able to reset the London plan. This is the main document through which the mayor sets planning policy. The boroughs have to fit their plans within the London plan. It has the force of law. And that will see, I think, much further increases in density, bigger developments to help pay for more stuff. And that is fine, except that the public is always a bit wary about super hyper density. And so that will require some explanation, I think, by the mayor.
So you touched on TfL, so let's move on to transport now. So Khan's perhaps headline initiative was the pledge to freeze TfL fares for the first term of his mayoralty. Is that a realistically deliverable pledge? Can we expect to see that brought in over the next 4 years? And can TfL afford it?
Well, I mean, Sadiq Khan said he'd do it, and TfL will now deliver it. There's no question. The mayor is in charge, and the mayor sets fares policy. Of course, it will mean TfL has less income than would otherwise have been the case. And by the way, it'll add to crowding. I mean, there are a number of issues facing London's transport, particularly the rail system. And, slightly slower fare increases will mean, or fares freeze, will mean slightly more crowding as the population grows. The reduction in income now, Sadiq Khan has said, and I think his term of art was that TfL was flabby. So the question then is, can he deliver efficiencies as fast as the fares would have gone up? And he probably could, actually. I mean, TfL is a big organisation with a very large, but a multi-billion-pound budget. It's bigger than many government departments. So it can probably find these efficiencies. But, there will always be slightly less money than there otherwise would have been if fares don't go up. And the thing that London really needs now is investment in extending the Bakerloo line, Crossrail 2, and actually upgrading the commuter rail system in South London. And that I think is that will be just that bit less money than there would have been because of the fares freeze.
Great. Okay, so let's now move on to the EU referendum. In British politics now, this is the only game in town, isn't it? Everything has paused while campaigning on the EU referendum takes place. So what are the implications of this?
Well, the EU referendum is a remarkable moment in British politics. I mean, it is a real choice that will have profound implications. And it's easy, I think, to understate them, even now, even when there's this sort of huge war going on in politics day after day after day. It's possible to sort of screen it out somehow and not realise it is a choice that has profound implications for the long term. Now, I mean, there are others who think, oh, well, it won't have such profound implications because if we vote to leave the EU, we'll negotiate ourselves back to a position that's not so very different from the one now, which, of course, if it happened, would beg the question of why we're going through all of this. So part of that complicated thought. It will be the only issue in British politics of any scale between now and June the 23rd, and the vote will have repercussions one way or the other. If we vote to stay, that will have profound repercussions. I don't think it'll stop people starting to campaign to leave again, by the way. But if we vote to leave, that's it. There'll then be a long period of renegotiation. It will change Britain, have lots of implications, and it will be a statement about the way the British think about themselves either way. So I think it is a very, very important issue.
So to just briefly go through the impact of it on the parties, the Conservative Party is currently, as you say, engaged in civil war. Will it be able to bring itself back together, reconcile the separate sides in the aftermath?
Well, I'm sure David Cameron thinks that after the referendum he can bring the Conservative Party back together. I mean, some remarkable things are being said at the moment. I mean, it is amazing, the sort of ferocity of the fight. But Cameron is a brilliant politician at starting again. He just sort of turns up the next morning outside Downing Street, all smart, and starts again. He's really good at that. So I think he thinks he'll be able to do that, have a reshuffle of his government, reset the government's priorities, and then say, we're going to move on, whichever way around. Now, if he survives, certainly if Britain votes to leave the EU, the question of his survival is much more important one than if he wins or Britain votes to stay. So I think he will think he can start again. Whether the Conservative Party will really get over some of the things that have been said about each other, I think some of that will linger on. The bitterness will linger on, whatever happens.
So the Labour Party is likely to play a crucial role. So all of the polling seems to indicate, excuse me, that whilst the Conservative Party is roughly split, about 50-50, the Labour Party tends to be around 80-20 in favour of staying, but turnout, and the turnout of Labour voters specifically, is likely to sway this one way or the other because of the desire to stay balanced against the reluctance to support a Conservative Prime Minister's position. So Jeremy Corbyn finds himself in very key position. This could be enormous one way or the other for the Labour Party, couldn't it?
It could, and actually I think the person, going back to our earlier discussion, another person who's absolutely crucial now in the EU referendum is Sadiq Khan. Sadiq Khan is now the most powerful elected Labour politician in the United Kingdom. He has the lustre of success. He's been feted by the Mayor of Paris, the Mayor of New York. He seems to have changed Donald Trump's policy all in 1 week. It's a remarkable position. So I'm pretty sure that David Cameron will want to work with Sadiq Khan as well as the Labour Party, Alan Johnson, clearly a kind of Labour politician all Conservatives like. So, but you're absolutely right. Labour and the Labour vote is absolutely essential in terms of the Prime Minister's policy, which is for Britain to stay in the EU. So it's true, Labour is important, and that requires Jeremy Corbyn, Alan Johnson, Sadiq Khan, David Miliband. I mean, all of these Labour figures to get the Labour vote out.
Do you think that there is a risk that by Labour's position, at least implied position, being that they back the position of the Conservative Party, but not the Conservative Party, that they end up undermining their own efforts, perhaps?
It is difficult. I mean, Labour is, I think, traumatised by its Scottish experience, where in the referendum there, it was easy to portray the Scottish Labour Party is supporting David Cameron and the Unionists, and so they're trying to be on the same side as the Prime Minister, but yet not on the same side as the Prime Minister. And there are ways of signalling that, but they've gone for their own campaign. What would be really interesting is I'd be really interested to see if Cameron can get Sadiq Khan to appear, if the two of them could appear on the same platform. I think that's I will look to see if that happens.
So finally, this should give UKIP a platform for establishing themselves properly in the mainstream of British politics. Is there any sign of that happening?
I mean, UKIP's position in the referendum is remarkable. I mean, you can see this in the tussle between the Leave campaign and ITV about who should appear on television to represent the Leave view in a debate. ITV has chosen Nigel Farage, and the Leave campaign think that will damage their message effectively, and they want to have one of their Leave politicians, Michael Gove or Boris Johnson, on this programme. And you can see in that UKIP's position is unusual, really, that they're the people who triggered all of this, they're the people who've led the debate, and they've got what they want. The referendum's finally balanced according to the polls, and yet it's not actually paying a particularly good dividend for UKIP. Their leadership is not seen as particularly helpful to the campaign. They did okay in the local elections, but not brilliantly. And so it's interesting how politics works. It's not been the great advantage for UKIP, the referendum, that one might have thought.
Right. Thank you very much, Tony. You're off the hot seat.